Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 29th of the Leap Day, 29th of February 2024. We're going to start with the equipment and military aid and other aid segment. And hopefully I'll get through this quick enough to do the geopolitical segment. I might have to separate them off. There's a lot to talk about again today. Right, so one of the big bits of news coming out over the last 24 hours is that the US, the Biden administration, the Pentagon, is now saying that, okay, there's this $4.2 billion worth of presidential drawdown authority left to be spent. Now's the time to consider spending it. A lot of people criticizing Biden. I guess, like, if you hate the Democrats, you'll criticize them over this, or if you feel really strongly about Ukraine such that, like, they need everything now, which is kind of like where I'm at. But also we need to understand what's going on here. So rather than just criticize all the time, I know I do that with certain people, but why have they waited this long to release $4 billion that would have been absolutely useful, needed, necessitated by the Ukrainians previously? Now, what's going on here is that, well, the authority allows defense articles to be drawn from US stocks. And also, there is this understanding coming out from the Pentagon apparently now that they are willing to do this without having the funding in place to replace those stocks. At least not now, not until something's got through Congress. And what happens often is the funding for Ukraine, this is kind of understanding how the funding works, is that the funding for Ukraine isn't so much about spending money on Ukraine. It's about spending money on updated equipment for the US and giving the older equipment to Ukraine. So what you're doing is you're basically spending on upgrading your own military forces. Is like, that's prima facie what's going on. Oh, and by the way, Ukraine get a load of stuff, but people don't quite understand that, and they think it's just money to Ukraine. What this might suggest, what it seems to suggest, is that $4 billion, which is not 60 billion, is a long way off that, could be used to give US stocks, but not pay for replacement of it. So it'll be the book value of US stocks, which I presume that then allows more stuff to go to Ukraine, because you're not then having to pay for replacement of it at a higher value for new stuff. So it's literally just book value of older stuff. Now, the US has a whole load of older stuff they don't particularly need anymore. ATACMS are being replaced. Bradleys are outdated. And, Abrams tanks, they've got a lot of those sitting around. So, the US can afford to do this. I think it's going to be more about ammunition, really, than anything else. So it could be a case of giving ATACMS and artillery ammunition to the tune of 4 billion, and then not necessarily replacing those stocks right now. Okay, fair enough, but you'd assume that they'll be able to do that fairly easily going forward. Okay. Going back to what I was initially discussing, is like, why now, not before? Because lots of people are screaming at the Biden administration, say, what the hell have you done waiting all this time when you could have given this away before? My thoughts is that they were just waiting on, hoping that the Republicans who are being difficult, like Mike Johnson, would come to their senses and allow the $60 billion to go. This is your last chance saloon funding. And if all other avenues have been exhausted, okay, at least we've got this $4 billion to rely on at the very end. But once that is done, you're done. So I presume that's what they've been thinking, which is, okay, it's not ideal because people have been dying, but they were just hoping that things would work out. And it didn't work out, and so now they've got this to rely on. But you can argue that would have been better spent up front. But then if you spend that up front, then you couldn't then say to Johnson, look, things are really desperate, they've got nothing, because we've just spent $4 billion on them. So I guess it was part of the convincing Johnson that things are desperate. And apparently Chuck Schumer, in that meeting with Speaker Johnson 2 nights ago, said it was a really intense meeting and they laid everything on the line, and yet Johnson still came out and said, it's all about the border. And as you know, I have no time for Johnson anymore at all. Not that I did any ever. So the CNN reporting Pentagon is considering tapping into the remaining $4 billion Ukraine defense aid fund. It's been reluctant to commit the remaining funds without guarantees they would be replenished through the $60 billion aid package, which is currently stuck in Congress. The U.S. Senate passed a foreign aid bill, which includes $95 billion for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, but House Speaker Johnson has so far refused to put it on to a vote in the House. And I am just flabbergasted that a single human being can dictate what is voted on, what isn't in US politics. It blows my mind that in this supposed shining beacon of democracy, one ne'er-do-well can dictate what happens in US politics. It's an incredible amount of power that Mike Johnson appears to have. It just blows my mind. Right, really good news. Finland has not set any restrictions on its arms aid, and Ukraine can use the weapons provided by Finland also on Russian soil, according to Jukka Kopra, the chairman of the Defence Committee for the Finnish Parliament. This is massive, and not least because the Ukraine has been unable to use Western weapons precisely because of this diktat that they shouldn't be used on Russian targets on Russian soil, even though those Russian targets are able to take off and send missiles into Ukraine. The Ukrainians aren't allowed to shoot back at those planes, either on the ground or potentially in the air, or certainly when they're on the ground in Russia. And so Finland are saying, no, we're cool with that. That's not a problem. This is huge, and I hope other nations follow suit. Now, we don't know what Finland has given to Ukraine and whether the Ukrainians indeed have any weapons that can be used in this way from the Finns. The Finns have been notoriously very secretive about what they've given to Ukraine. There's just fingers crossed that actually there's a few bits and pieces in the Finnish arsenal that they've given to Ukraine that they can use against the Russians in Russia. Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, who I think is just being a marvellous voice for reason in this war from a European point of view, has said that the measure that has been mentioned with regard to Macron talking about troops on the ground, European NATO troops, or whatever, Western troops on the ground in Ukraine shouldn't be ruled out. People misinterpreted what he said, went hammer and tongs at him. Lots of people were like, oh no, we've got to come out and say we won't commit troops. And basically that's been done by lots of the major powers like Germany, Poland, even the UK, I think, has made signals that we won't, even though we already have SAS working out there. So it's annoying. And actually, Ukraine the Latest podcast, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, who is a former tank commander, now does a lot of writing and talking and analysis about this kind of stuff, about defense matters. He was like, I'm absolutely on side of Macron here, and I don't understand why everyone's reacting in the way they're doing. I'm fully with this. You've got to keep the option open, and this is what Kaja Kallas is saying here. I think these are also signals that we are sending to Russia that we are not ruling out different things. We should do everything so that Ukraine wins. What Hamish de Bretton Gordon was saying was, if we say we're not going to send troops, then that cuts down your options. And then straight away, you are telling Russia that we're prepared to go only so far. And then Russia's like that just is to the benefit of Russia and their decision making going forward. I totally agree with Emmanuel Macron, what he said. And it annoys me that people have either misreported what he said, because it's not about Western troops on the front lines necessarily. It's about people working in field hospitals, maybe people working in logistics, people working on the borders, people working in maintenance, Western military personnel, and then that allows Ukrainians to push more to the front lines. I think that's incredibly important. We can help out in loads of ways there, and I think Emmanuel Macron was right to say what he did, and it's great to see Kaja Kallas saying the same. Now, talking about the Czechia, Petr Pavel, the president of Czechia, who said, right, we can find 800,000 shells. We just need a whole bunch of money towards getting those from Turkey, South Africa, India, wherever it is, to Ukraine. Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, and it was really good to see him on that panel at the Munich Security Conference luncheon that I referred to a lot the other day, and he was one of the keynote speakers there. And it's great because Belgium has a very, well, quite a sizable defence industrial base. but B, they've underfunded their own armed forces for a long time, and they haven't really done enough bilaterally with Ukraine. I think they rely a lot on what goes through EU funding, which is fair enough, because actually, as a percentage of GDP, I think they're still above the UK, as far as I know, and above US in terms of a percentage of GDP of what they give to Ukraine. It just, most of it comes through the EU. So, two sides of the square. But he has announced that the country, Belgium, will provide 200 million euros to the Czech initiative to urgently supply 800,000 artillery rounds to Ukraine. This will allow more weapons to reach Ukraine in the coming weeks. Really good news from Belgium there. Whoop, whoop. So now Belgium, the UK, Netherlands, Denmark, Canada, and Sweden have all signed on to this Czech-led effort. That's really good news that Ukraine will get at least a whole bunch of artillery ammunition. I mean, sadly enough, 200 million euros sounds like an awful lot of money, and it is an awful lot of money. I very much like that. Thank you very much. But it doesn't go that far when it comes to buying artillery ammunition. It ain't cheap. Right, hell of a stat, says Shashank Joshi, referring to Paul McCleary here, saying, and this is the Czech defense, who refers to the Czech defense policy chief Jan Yeres, saying some crucial segments of the European defense industry are now performing better than US defense industry. Rheinmetall in Germany is producing way more 155mm artillery shells than the entire US defense industry combined. Now, Rheinmetall has bought some concerns that are making artillery ammunition, and so statistically they are ramping. Their production is pretty sizable now, and they've ramped it up. But the idea that Rheinmetall in Germany is producing way more 155mm shells than the entire US defense industry combined might be debatable. There are different people who are looking at those stats. Nonetheless, the point is, shouldn't be a competition of who's providing more. Oh, we're doing more than the US or whatever. It's like both are superbly important. Now, Shashank Joshi then, does Armin Perpinger, the CEO of Rheinmetall. He's getting a lot of kudos these days. Someone else does chime in here and says, by April, the USA will be producing 432,000 shells per year, which will increase to 720,000 by end of year. So actually, the US is at a pretty good point now and will be at a much better point at the end of the year. They're quite reactive, as has been said before, partly because they're actually government owned. And the government has been able to instruct a ramping up of ammunition production, irrespective of long-term contracts. So they're not worried. Like private industrial concerns will say, well, we're not going to start ramping up production until we've got a contract to say that we have got sustained procurement or sustained orders going on for 5 years. And then once we've done that, we can then justify building big machines up, putting all the capital in place to build these artillery pieces or this artillery ammunition. Whereas national concerns, I mean, this is almost like a counterintuitive point about like state-run enterprises versus the reactive private sector and the free market. Actually, in this particular instance, it's been argued that being state-run has allowed US to be far more reactive, because they can just say, throw caution to the wind and say, yep, we're going to ramp up production. Doesn't matter about sustainability going forward 5 years. They need it now. You're going to do it, and we're ordering you to do that. So whatever. So Rheinmetall is currently claiming a capacity of 350,000, largely due to the purchase of XPAL. RHM capacity is not set to reach 700,000 until 2025, by which point the USA will be at 840,000. So there's some comeback to those claims. Whatever the truth is good news that is taking place. That Rheinmetall is significantly upping European production of artillery ammunition. Brief update on Rheinmetall's planned 155mm factory in Ukraine. They are currently looking for a location, so in Ukraine, for indigenous production. As soon as the construction of 155mm factory has begun, the production of modern artillery shells is expected to start after 12 to 15 months, just like their new facility at Unterlüß. So this is good. They are ramping up. They are building new factories, indeed one in Ukraine. But it's still a long-term project. So Germany is also financing another 20 Caracal air mobile platforms. These are jeeps that you can pick up with a helicopter and throw down somewhere else, relatively mobile. The delivery will take place over the following months, according to ES&T. Rheinmetall reported on this at the Unforced Attack Defense Trade Fair. The vehicles will most likely be used by Ukrainian special forces Prior to the now 20 financed vehicles, Germany already financed 5 Caracals in November 2023. So good news, Germany's just doing an awful lot, aren't they? F-16 will arrive in, although sometimes you don't know who's financing them. It does say they are Germany's financing them, but sometimes it might be like Rheinmetall is making these things, but it's actually financed either by other nations or financed by Ukraine directly. And then the question is, well, if they're getting their money from Germany or America, then essentially they're getting the money in to then spend out on. And this then goes back to, even when money does go out of, say, the United States to Ukraine, like directly, then quite often that money is then spent back from their own kind of like free will, if you like. They're not. They just need stuff, and they go back to American contractors or concerns or German concerns to buy their stuff. So yeah, money flows all over the shop. Anyway, the vehicles are they look pretty decent, and they are going to be useful for the Ukrainians. F-16s will arrive in Ukraine gradually, is the claim here, and it's difficult to predict how long this process will take. The transfer of aircraft to Ukraine will be largely related to the replacement in NATO countries by more modern F-35. I mean, a bunch of them have been already given and are being done up, and I think that they will go to Ukraine as soon as they're ready, and as soon as the Ukrainians are ready, and as soon as the air bases and the maintenance provision is ready. But there will be further F-16s that I assume will be drip fed as they become available due to say F-35 replacements or whatever. Ukrainian Review also says, quoting from Bloomberg, Ukraine's strategy is to try to hold the front line as long as possible until the second half of the year, when it could receive F-16s and Western ammunition production should increase. This would allow planning for another possible counteroffensive in 2025. So as long as they can vaguely hold their ground now in a sensible way with a kind of sort of active defense, although that's been difficult in a number of places, if they can just prepare themselves ready for 2025, then it might be in a lot better position. I keep saying that going forward, Ukraine are just in a better position, and a long-term much better position than Russia, which is why I think you'll see Russia trying desperately to do everything now. If you're being as positive for Ukraine as possible, it's like for Russia, it's now or bust. So going forward, the production of ammunition, I think, will overtake Russia's abilities from Europe and the US, assuming long-term US support, and there isn't some kind of weird thing, and we'll come to that later. But assuming US support and European support, I think Ukraine will be in a consistently better position. So that's why Russia is trying desperately to ruin democracies in the EU and elsewhere, because they need to unseat politicians who will support Ukraine, and they will need to get in extremist governments who are more likely to support Russia. So that's part of their long-term strategy. And then on the battlefront, it's like everything now. They need to take as much now, because actually they can't guarantee to be in a better position than Ukraine with regard to equipment going forward. I think they can guarantee that in terms of boots on the ground, but I still think it's wise for the Russians to be going for it now. Right, Britain will hand over a new type of demining equipment. It's a mine and route clearance tracked demining machine, the MW370, or the Mine Wolf. It's an armoured mine and route clearance vehicle, and UK sending that to Ukraine. I don't know how many of them. Might just be one. Right, just part of a tweet thread that I wanted to dip into from Shashank Joshi, quoting from actually Royal United Services Institute, the UK military think tank. Much like the downgraded Abrams tank, the Ukrainians will receive older F-16 variants. Now, we know they are getting upgraded for greater radar capability, I think, but there still is this problem that when the West gives stuff to Ukraine, we don't often give the best. So the Abrams had to be downgraded so they didn't have the depleted uranium armor on it, because they didn't want the Russians to get hold of that. And the same with the F-16. So they lack advanced avionics, software, and sensors, and the most advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles will not be supplied until 2026. And that, I think, is a real crying shame. The Ukrainians just need as much as they can get hold of, but the better that stuff is, the better they will do, and the quicker this war will come to a close. The ambassador of Ukraine to Australia, Vasil Miroshnichenko, held a presentation for key representatives of the Australian Ministry of Defence, urging for more aid to Ukraine. He appealed for tanks, Taipan helicopters that are now being dismantled and buried, money, and a change in how Australia considers Ukrainian aid. Absolutely good stuff. Hope that Australia comes through that. And we're going to be referring to Australia quite a bit in a second. So for all my Australian friends, we're going to have some Malcolm Turnbull opinions. Ukraine received $760 million in grants from Norway and Japan. They will be used to compensate for state budget and social payments, according to the Ministry of Finance. Good news. And Lithuania allocates €300,000 in support of Ukrainian refugees. That's fantastic. Good stuff. Lithuania and the Balkans, the Baltics in general, are being such staunch supporters of Ukraine. Right. On to Russian equipment now. The Russian Air Force reportedly used their latest Su-57 fighter jet. So this is arguably a fifth generation fighter. I mean, some argue it's not that good. But anyway, they haven't been using it. They haven't been using their best jet. I think there's been some relatively rare, or exceptionally rare occurrences of them having used them. But they've been using them in recent combat operations, apparently targeting Ukrainian military positions in the east of Ukraine. On February the 18th, escorted by two Su-35 jets, the Su-57 launched a missile strike on Ukrainian targets. Sources suggested that the aircraft utilized the advanced Kh-69 stealthy cruise missile, specifically designed for the Su-57. There are claims that if it's not the Kh-69, it's some other missiles that can only be carried by certain planes are going to be adapted to be shot more widely by the Russian fleet. So I think there's adaptations going on so that more things can fire more stuff. He says, using technical language. Operating from the occupied territory of the Luhansk region, Su-57 entered Ukrainian airspace under escort and launched a missile. Despite a technical malfunction, the missile missed its target and crashed in a field. Not despite it, because of a technical malfunction. So lucky for the Ukrainians there. Now, this, if it's operating from a Luhansk airbase, then this is ATACMS. I mean, screaming out for an ATACMS strike on air bases. Like every airbase in occupied territories should have been absolutely hammered. Now, this come from Geraman, but he says that some Starlink systems have been handed over to the Russian forces. They are very obviously using Starlink. There's no argument that they're using Starlink. Everyone knows they're using Starlink. The question is, how are they using it? Now, when it's close to the front lines with Ukrainian forces, then you can't geofence off that area because then the Ukrainians would be unable to use it. But it means they are able to use them in Crimea and in Luhansk behind the front lines very much at their leisure. And does that contravene sanctions? And what is Starlink doing aiding the Russians? I mean, it seems insanely bizarre that Elon Musk could turn off Starlink from being used in Crimea area so that Ukrainians couldn't use it, but now allows them to be used by the Russians in Crimea and in Luhansk. It's staggering. But then I talked about that kind of information situation earlier. Right, I'm going to stop the video now and then do my geopolitics one later. Please watch out. I've got some fascinating, particularly Malcolm Turnbull quotes from a recent Q&A on Australian TV that I think is that are particularly pertinent. Anyway, speak soon.